Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Religion Media Centre discussion. We're watching the dust settle, or not, after the General Synod narrowly voted to allow standalone services of prayers for and with same-sex couples on a trial basis. And this will go alongside more work on the Living in Love and Faith process. In case anyone needs reminding, Living in Love and Faith is a major project in the Church of England exploring sexuality, gender and marriage, which began in 2017 and which shows no sign of concluding soon. We've a number of guests who I'll be calling on. Some have been delayed on trains and may hopefully reach us before the end of the session. There are others on the call who may wish to make a contribution. Please raise your hand, put questions, comments in the chat box, and if you indicate the area you wish to talk about, it'll help me steer the conversation in a coherent fashion. You will forgive me, I hope, if I interrupt you or I'm clumsy in other ways. I have yet to sign up for the Geoffrey Tattersall School of Synod Management. I'm sure you are all looking to do that too. There was a groundhog feel to the debate in some ways. The substantive arguments are hardly new, and many people arriving at Synod said it felt as if the decision that had been made in February had never been taken. So for anyone who didn't follow every twist and turn, I'm going to ask two of our guests just to help me with, first of all, a factual, no comment account of what actually happened in this synod, and first of all, maybe what happened in February. So Helen King, Professor Helen King, you're a lay member of Synod. What was it, in a sentence, that Synod agreed in February?
In February, we agreed a composite motion, which agreed things like lamenting the damage that has been done to LGBT people in the church already, to commend the learning process of living in love and faith, which went out to parishes and has been done quite widely within the church, to welcome the decision to replace issues in human sexuality, which is the document which we replaced by pastoral guidance. So that was another sort of factor of this, because that's used by people who are discerning a vocation as to whether they agree with this document, whether they can go forward or not. To look forward to the prayers of love and faith being commended and further refined, and then to come back in 5 years' time to discuss whether those prayers were going well or not. And finally, and this was an amendment that was added in February, to endorse the decision that the doctrine of marriage was not to be changed in any way. That's, I think, where we were in February.
What was agreed yesterday and how was it different?
Most of that composite motion from February really wasn't addressed yesterday. The overall motion was simply to approve, to commend, to go ahead with the process that's going on with the bishops. So to look at what's happened since February and to say, yep, that seems to be going in the right sort of direction. There was then one amendment that was passed that was significant, and that is one which encourages the bishops, invites the bishops to go back and think again about their decision not to commend standalone services of blessing. At the moment, the prayers of love and faith can only be used, will be used when they're commended, I think in December. They will only be able to be used in an existing service with a couple. So within a service of communion or morning prayer or evening prayer, there will be some extra prayers that can go in to respect, honor, commend their relationship. But there will not be a standalone service. The amendment is saying that the House of Bishops is encouraged to consider having standalone services. And since that amendment was proposed by a bishop, the Bishop of Oxford, and supported strongly in the House of Bishops, that would suggest that they are going to think about that.
My understanding is that they are going to put forward a standalone service that could be trialled within weeks or months. Is that right? Now,
I don't know what the timescale is. I haven't heard that, but yes, it would be on a trial basis, an experimental basis. It would not be something that was formally going through the processes of the Church of England. The bishops would just trial it.
Right. Now, Susie Leaf, I mean, you're a writer and journalist as well as having a particular take on this. So as a writer and a journalist, it would appear that something happened between February Synod and this around the sort of the need or not for a legal route for these services. Can you bring in the dreaded words B2 and maybe B5 and maybe B58 and just explain them as succinctly as you can.
The Church of England's liturgy, the way in which we pray, the approved services, all have to, according to the canons of the Church of England, have to be neither contrary nor indicative of any departure from the doctrine of the Church of England in any essential matter. And so really what has been going on is an argument in the background as to how does one prove that the prayers of love and faith, whether the prayers within the service or whether the prayers of a standalone service are indicative of such a change. And I think there's been quite a lot of different legal advice being given to the bishops. And one of the big arguments was, why can't we see that advice? And there was a lot of conversation around that. But there are various ways in which the Church of England can say, this is a service, this is a prayer that you can use in church. And so the dreaded B2, B2 is the kind of most formal way in which the Church of England can say yes to a new service. And that requires the liturgy to be written down. It requires the words of the prayers to be scrutinised by General Synod, for people to be able to jump up and say, I think you should change this word or that word or the other word. And then at the end of the day, after several kind of rewritings of the prayers, it comes back to General Synod for another big debate. And at that point, it needs a 2/3 majority of the House of Bishops, the House of Clergy, and the House of Laity. And then once that's all stamped through, and usually that goes through without any problem at all, that gets stamped, and then suddenly that becomes a service that can be used in the Church of England. B5A is an approach where the archbishops can say, well, look, we've got this liturgy. We think it's appropriate to be used, and we will say that it can be used in certain settings as an experiment. But that has to be with the view to go to B2 in the end. And so I think what they did was initially they decided, oh, we'll go to B2 straight away. And then they've realised that actually they could run the B5A approach with B2 at the end. So in other words, for a couple of years, there'll be the opportunity to use this service as an experiment alongside this long process of enabling the prayers to be sort of legally accepted by the General Synod.
Right. The issue may be that B2 changes, so a formal sort of a standalone service requiring 2/3 of General Synod would not, in this synod, almost certainly get approval without some significant wheeling and dealing, I would think, behind the scenes. Can I come to the Archdeacon of Blackburn, Mark Ireland? I mean, when you spoke in synod, you said you were sad not to support the motion that was actually passed with its amendment, and you said that time was needed to get it right. I mean, what would getting it right look like? I'm going to ask you to be really quite succinct, but what would it look like for you to see Synod or the Church getting this right?
Thank you, Rosie. The reason I'm sad is that we're introducing significant change without a consensus among the faithful, what the Church calls a consensus fidelium. It was such a slim majority of one vote in the House of Laity on Bishop Steve's amendment. And even though 23 bishops voted in favour of the final motion, that's less, I think, than half the membership of the House of Bishops. So quite a number of bishops weren't present in the chamber. And without a consensus, the danger is that it brings division in the church. When we had the women bishops debate some time ago, I was on the side arguing for change and was disappointed when the draft legislation fell by 4 votes. But in fact, looking back, I'm glad, because it made us do some further theological work and come to a position where, in the end, the legislation provided a framework for mutual flourishing, which has stood the test of time. At the moment, we don't have anything like a 2/3 majority. And that 2/3 majority only came about because actually people who couldn't in conscience accept the ordination of women as bishops were able to vote for the legislation because they knew that they would still have an honoured and protected place in the church. That's what's lacking in the current arrangements, because there is no pastoral reassurance. It's simply at the moment still a blank sheet of paper, and even the pastoral guidance is missing all the difficult bits.
Bishop Jill Duff, drafts for pastoral provision for people who are unable to go along with this change. I mean, have you seen any drafts for pastoral provision? Do you know what that might look like?
There are some headlines in the documents, actually, and that's in public domain, but the actual reality of that isn't there. And obviously one of the motions, there's a beautiful motion by the Bishop of Durham, Paul Butler, saying, you know, we'd love clearer provision and a way of recognising each other as children made in the image of God, and a real sense of trying to bring people together. And that was voted down, which is a disappointment to many of us in the House, actually.
I mean, what we heard over the last couple of days, somebody saying, you know, I love you all, but I can't walk with you. Bishops talk about it being a time of uncertainty, but, well, it may be, but it's not just that that's uncertainty, that people can't, won't, don't walk together on this issue. Mandy Ford, you're Dean of Bristol, and you spoke to Synod, and you said, well, you know, people have been blessing these relationships or praying with same-sex couples in the church for ever and a day almost. So what's your take on what's happening in Synod? I mean, I think you used the word proxy, suggestion that the debate was about something else.
Yeah, I think the reality is that we know that we are a church which has an enormously broad range of views on how we read scripture, what kind of church we think we are, how we understand the sacraments. And we've lived with that in that tension with all its richness. And, you know, that, in a sense, to me, that's the genius of the Church of England. And for many years since the introduction of civil partnerships, there have been places where services of thanksgiving following a civil partnership have taken place with the knowledge of bishops. And I think going right back to the shared conversations in human sexuality, there's been a desire for some more transparency, that our differences should be recognised, and that we shouldn't be doing things hole and corner, but we should acknowledge those differences. And that was, I think, the driver for this whole process. Unfortunately, in the interim, I think that we have become less tolerant and less good at being willing to give one another that gracious space. And that was the point that I was wanting the Synod to hear yesterday, and particularly with regard to the standalone services, because for many of us, without standalone services, the provision that was being offered was, to be frank, less than we do already.
And you saying people have been having services or having their partnerships blessed by bishops, or with full approval of bishops. Are other bishops saying that? I mean, do different bishops say, yeah, well, you know, do they openly sort of say that, or is it all a little bit under the radar?
Actually hasn't been my experience in this diocese, so I can't speak for my current bishop, and I'm certainly not prepared to speak on behalf of previous ones without consulting them. I think the issue has been that much of this has been around private acquiescence rather than a public statement of approval. One of the things I think we can all agree about yesterday's debate in Synod was how refreshing it was to see our bishops standing up for what they believed and being honest about the disagreement within the House of Bishops. I think that was a much healthier place to be.
As the one bishop on the call, Bishop Jill, as I think, you could correct me if I'm wrong, maybe one of a minority among the bishops. I mean, how does it feel in the College of Bishops at the moment with this debate raging on?
I think we feel the responsibility very heavily. As you'll notice from the numbers, there was just 37 of us in the chamber, and we need to find a way forward together that enables the church to flourish. There's quite a different voting pattern, if you may be aware, of bishops this time to last time. Quite a lot more voted against the motion, and so in some ways, as Archdeacon Mark pointed out, not even half the bishops overall voted. But I think as a House of Bishops, we need to find a way forward together and have those conversations together. I was disappointed, as I mentioned before, that the motion that would enable some of those conversations to go forward wasn't passed. So we've got quite a lot of meetings going forward over the next couple of months, and we've got good relationships. And I think, as Dean Mandy just said, I think it's actually helpful. It's become clearer what people think. I said to my colleague John Inge, I was really pleased that he led that statement from 44 bishops, who produced quite a different statement to me and another 11, 12 bishops, 12 of us, from a different point of view. And I think that's helpful to have those a bit more.
So is the key for the way forward going to be in the kind of provision that is made for people who are unhappy with any changes?
I think it cuts both ways. I think that's what we're finding as a House of Bishops. So something that a phrase that the Archbishops coined was, this puts a target on the back of clergy, those who use the prayers.
They said that you said that in Synod, didn't you?
So I said that instead because I was just quoting what they'd said before. So because that's our concern under the exactly, that's why the legalities are quite important, really. So we've had a bit of pushback from clergy who want to use the services, that they want to feel kind of safe and assured in that, and clergy who are unsure about it, they also want to feel safe and assured.
Right. There was a little bit of criticism of you yesterday using those words, targets on the back of, but you were, first of all, it wasn't your phrase you're saying, but also are you saying that both clergy who on either side are worried about being subject to sort of legal challenges? Is that the basic?
Yeah, I think that's our feedback when we've come together as bishops, and I hope that's from across the whole spectrum. That's as I understand it. So, and that's my experience on the ground as well. So, what I wanted to say was, clarity is kindness, and I think that I understand the framing we're in a period of uncertainty. Though I think, as Vaughan Roberts observed, actually there's quite a bit of certainty in the chamber. I think there's more certainty in the House of Bishops on different views, but actually how we bring those together and find a way forward is the really important thing. I have faith it can be done, because I think our relationships as a house are in a very different place than some of the guys who are retiring say they were, back in the days when we called each other Lancaster and Durham and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. So, I guess part of the problem is not just the relationships within the house, is it? There's a lack of trust in bishops, which was very evident at Synod. Patrick Richmond, you're a chair of the House of Clergy in the Norwich Diocese. Have you any thoughts on what pastoral provision might look like?
Thank you. Yes. Pastoral provision is required, I think, because we are touching on creedal issues like the apostolicity of the church, which means that we are preserving the teaching of the apostles, that it's according to the scriptures, as the Nicene Creed says, that these are gospel issues, salvation issues, because the New Testament describes what the holiness of Christians involves, and that holiness has always involved shunning sexual immorality. And I don't want to offend anyone, and I recognise there are different definitions of sexual immorality around, but because these are such central issues, salvation issues, explicitly warned against in the New Testament, that these things can mean you won't inherit the kingdom of God. These are such important issues that if your bishop seems to be commending or approving or celebrating or even condoning in a way, you immediately feel that your communion with your bishop is threatened.
Right. So can I just cut to the quick a little bit? I mean, what might pastoral provision look like?
What might it look like? Well, it requires us to have safe space with bishops who understand and can support these traditional aspects of the church. And there are different models that are out there. And as has been mentioned, the documents so far do have a few headline suggestions. For example, I'm in a diocese where all 3 of my bishops have signed a letter by 44 bishops showing enthusiasm for moving on as fast as possible with allowing, for example, clergy to be in civil same-sex marriages. So I don't have any bishop who is supportive of my position. Even if one of them was to sort of take a role and not do the blessings, I would know that they're not doing that entirely from the heart. So we need bishops who we can look to, who have some authority and structure, because all my license to minister in my parish comes from my bishop.
Right.
It's a very awkward position, but it is something that needs to be discussed. And even the headlines, it doesn't sound yet like the bishops are saying they want to go ahead with this. They are studying it. And we recognise that there are going to be practical issues, and there probably needs to be a transitional period. Indeed, this whole process seems to be described as a period of uncertainty. And that uncertainty, sadly, goes towards the sort of pastoral provision and safe space that the different views in the church can seek to inhabit.
I guess, I mean, whether pastoral provision means, you have a different bishop looking over you, whether, I mean, some churches have been talking about, quite separate structures, which would involve removal, presumably, of some of their sort of support for the institutional church and so on. I wonder, Helen King, could you say something a little bit about what the different ways in which the provision might play out?
Well, I've been involved in something called the St. Hughes Conversations, which brought together people from various different positions in the church over a couple of years. And I've also been involved in some of the Living in Love and Faith discussions from the beginning, when I was involved in writing the resources, and also some of the more recent meetings in September. And I've heard everything, really, from separate provinces, like maybe a third province where people who believe it's okay to bless same-sex relationships can be hived off, and that's not called the Church of England, it's called something else. I've heard much more, I think, plausible versions, like within each diocese or area or group of dioceses, there would be some bishop who would take responsibility for looking after those who did not agree with same-sex blessings. I've also heard extreme versions, like separate diocesan directors of ordinands. The idea you can't even trust the person who's looking after your vocation to ministry unless they agree with you on this issue. That seems to me insane. Oh, sorry, I've said that word there, but I think, honestly, it is insane. It's far too much. Oh, a tiny thing. We're not talking same-sex marriage here. That's a much bigger issue. We're talking about blessings. It's a really small thing for a really huge proposed differentiation.
Okay, so I'm glad to say that British Rail, or whatever it's called these days, was on our side, and Andrew Goddard has arrived from the Church of England Evangelical Council, which put out a statement saying we might hear more in the next couple of days, but maybe we can get it even from you before that, if possible, Andrew. I mean, is the CEEC going to say, this is the provision that we want? Is it going to say, we're taking our bat and ball away? What might we hear from you in the next few days?
I don't know exactly what's in there. I'm not employed by the CEC. I'm a member of the Church of England Evangelical Council, and they have, as you say, said they will say something next week. And I think we need to wait to see exactly what that is. The signs have been from things that have been said, that amongst many evangelicals there are concerns that relate to some of the issues that have been touched on, about the fact that some people find, as Patrick has said, there isn't a single bishop, even though there are a number of bishops in his diocese, who continues to clearly uphold the doctrine of the church in this area, and who is supporting a move which, although in one sense, I can see why Helen says in one sense you might say is quite minor, is nevertheless acknowledged to be indicative of a departure from the Church of England's doctrine. And that does obviously create significant questions for people. I think the CEC is very keen to talk those things through. It's not going to take its bat and ball away, as I think you said. Many people in the CEC were talking with Helen and others in those St. Hugh's conversations. We have done, I think it's fair to say, more work on the various options there could be than I've seen from any other organisation. And our hope is that others will join seriously now in that conversation, because the one thing this shows is that we are even more divided, I think, than many of us realised, and we're in a slightly odd situation where it is the bishops who are leading the church in a particular direction away from where it has been guided by the bishops, not just for recent decades, but for centuries. And it's the clergy and the laity who are resisting almost 50-50, 52-48, 51-49.
I was just looking at the statement from the CEC, which says that the bishop's proposals would tear local parish congregations apart, cause churches across the diocese to feel as though their shepherds have abandoned them. I hear from other church congregations saying, I thought we'd done all that. Why are we still talking about it? I mean, you are party to these congregations, are you, which feel abandoned, which feel that they are torn apart on this issue?
Yes, I know lots of people who would say that is the situation, and in all sorts of different ways. Some it's relatively small, but it is causing a lot of pain. I have, can think of literally finding myself in tears with someone because they were so upset at what was going on and how they were struggling to make sense of this. That's not a monopoly on evangelical churches, though. That is happening across the church in all sorts of different places. And I think we need to therefore stop. And it was good to hear Bishop Jill saying that the bishops need to stop and say, okay, what does this show us about the sort of church that we are? You said, some are saying, I thought we dealt with all of this. It was 20 years ago that Archbishop Rowan said, we're suddenly discovering there are so many different Church of Englands. And we just need to work out what that means for how we then define ourselves. The CEC's documents are not saying we don't want you in the Church of England. They're saying what might the Church of England have to look like in order to do the sort of thing that was put forward in a number of the motions, including by the Bishop of Durham.
If I use the word schism, you'd say nonsense, would you? Because it feels so sort of intractable, and it does feel, the conversations I've had with people saying, look, this won't pass in this synod. This won't get through. So we've got years and years more of this stuff. So what word do you use for that?
It's division. It's a language of pain, and we have that acknowledged, in the motion itself. I don't want to use the language of schism because I do recognise that there are people who are fellow Christians who disagree fundamentally on this, and I want to seek, as close fellowship as I can with them, but I cannot do that in a way that enables what I believe to be them moving away from the teaching of the church to have no effect whatsoever. We need to think seriously, what is it that's happening here, and how can we live as well together as possible? And I think that now clearly, given the experience of these debates this year, given the votes that we have, that clearly means putting at the front, not the back of the line, these discussions about whether you call it differentiation or for pastoral provision or pastoral reassurance or formal structural provision. There are different names for it, but it needs to get to these questions about how we best work together while acknowledging and, where necessary, distinguishing between two incompatible sets of beliefs, one of which is in continuity with what the church has taught, the other of which believes that needs to be developed and changed in a way that, though they think it's faithful, people like me cannot recognise it in that way.
Thank you. Charlie Bell, I just wonder, you're a curate at St John's the Divine in Kennington. You're a campaigner on this issue. You're not a member of Synod, you were observing it. I just wonder what you felt as Synod was prorogued yesterday about where you are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to be honest, speaking as a gay man, it's a positive move for us. Finally, it's a gentle but a positive move. I've been disturbed by some of the language and some of the way that people have spoken throughout the debates. I found the debates intensely painful to listen to, and I'm someone who is really pretty hard. You have to really work hard to upset me, and I found it deeply distressing, some of the things that were being said yesterday. I just want to pick up on a few things. I mean, we keep hearing about the teaching of the church as though that's an abstract thing. I worry that we talk too much about the church or people as abstract things. We're real people here. And I feel like one thing that has been lost and was lost utterly during the debate yesterday, in what I can only describe as a scandalous fashion, was the idea that who is it that has faced persecution and attempts at destruction and being wiped out in human history? Amongst those people are not conservative evangelicals, but amongst them are queer people. If you walk down the streets in my own city in London, as a queer person, you run the risk of being spat at, of being beaten up, of being stabbed, of being killed. That is the reality of being a queer person in a so-called open and affirming culture as we currently have in the United Kingdom. I think it is astounding, the use of the word putting a target on people's back. I think that is an astoundingly inappropriate thing to say. Gene Robinson was ordained and consecrated a bishop 20 years ago, almost exactly 20 years ago, and wore a bulletproof vest during his consecration and ordination in Washington National Cathedral because of the death threats put against him. We have spent years and years and years systematically persecuting queer people by the state and within our church. And I am astounded the language of victimhood that has been adopted by those who have spent so long trying to prevent us to even having prayers said over us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Charlie. I wonder if I could just talk a little bit about the practicality of trialing the standalone services, because this would be done under B5A, which would be authorised by the archbishops, but I think would eventually have to go through another process. So this is going to happen alongside synod working out a sort of more formal legal process. I mean, first of all, we're told that these standalone services might be trialled quite soon. I wonder where they will happen and how they will be evaluated. And I don't know, Dean Mandy, whether it's fair to pick on you here, but, you know, as the dean of a cathedral, I wonder whether cathedrals might see this as a sort of, you know, opportunity for reaching out to members in their community. They're lovely places for these things to take place. I wonder whether you would be looking, for instance, at Bristol to trial some of these standalone services.
We undoubtedly will. I know our congregation went through the Living in Love and Faith process, and our chapter have already indicated that they would welcome being able to use such services. So we're very likely to be one of those places that opts into this experimental period. I think it's important to say that I can say that confidently because I know where my bishop stands, and that there isn't a huge amount of division within my congregation. And we are very much seeking to be a place of radical inclusion. So we will be, God willing. But I recognise that that's not the case for every cathedral. We, as cathedrals, it's really important that we are the cathedral for the whole diocese, and there'll need to be careful work with our with colleagues around the diocese for us to be sure that those folk will still feel able to come for the big diocesan occasions to send their candidates for ordination services and those things. But I think we're very fortunate that we have worked long and hard in this diocese to learn how to disagree well, and I envisage that we will continue to do so.
Okay, one scenario is that we have lots of trials. I mean, I don't know. Again, I don't know how they're evaluated. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about that. But let's say we have these trials, and lots of people, you know, they have a standalone service, they really appreciate it, and then a couple of years down the line, synod reaches an impasse in the B2 phase, and says, well, we can't legislate for a standalone service. Where does that, you can't go on unblessing people that you've already blessed, but I mean, I wonder where that leaves the couples who have gone through this process, and indeed whether it's kind to allow people to go through that process when there's still the possibility that synod may vote down any substantial change. I'm going to ask you, Archdeacon, whether you might respond to that, but if anyone else wants to, please raise your hand.
I think that point, Rosie, illustrates the uncertainty and the difficulty of going through to allowing standalone services to take place without all the other steps in place, because really we want to have a place where LGBTQI plus people are able to flourish in the church, but also where those who hold to a traditional understanding of marriage, like myself, are also able to flourish and know that we have a future in the church, which is why really I would far prefer that we don't do our theology in a rush, but actually come to a point where we seek a consensus fidelium, a consensus together, and move together as we did with women bishops, where we know that there is provision, and therefore those who are unable to accept in conscience the change know that they have a secure future. Because at the moment, this is creating uncertainty on the very people who are hoping to be blessed through this process.
I do think this is a real pastoral difficulty, but I also want to make the point that we're being told when it is convenient that these aren't actually blessing same-sex relationships. And of course, we do bless people all the time. So these services, the prayers of love and faith, do not bless same-sex relationships in a simple way. They're blessing the people and they're picking out some of the good qualities of that relationship. So this is part of the studied ambiguity of this transitional period of uncertainty, that it's not going to be the case that we're no longer blessing people, but we won't have the prayers of love and faith when the usual legal process of B2 really completes.
That's a very helpful. Thank you very much. I want to, Jodie Stow, I don't know if you would say what you think about the changes that have been agreed. You spoke at Synod.
Yes, I guess I just want to say there that the suite of prayers are going to be commended under Canon B5, so that's not then going on to a process, so they will continue to be available. So that's important to recognise. And I guess, you know, I'm not LGBT myself, so I wanted to, you know, listen really well to those who are, and who overwhelmingly saw this as a positive move, as Charlie was saying, you know, gentle but a positive move forward. And so I want to honour that. I think that's what we voted for in February. I think this is just being true to what Synod already voted for at that point. So I think it's really important. It was really hard work, what we did over the last few days, but the fact that we did it again, and it's now clear, you know, we need to keep going forward with it. Andrew Goddard is an old friend of mine, so it's nice to see him here. And I think so. I'm a convener of something called Inclusive Evangelicals. So I think where I'm at now is I really want to listen to what provision will look like. I think for us that is a step inward from what I've understood that the Church of England Evangelical Council has been saying, which does to me sound like schism, even if that's not the word that is being used. So I take what Andrew has been saying, but I want to hear from those who are kind of conservative evangelicals in particular, but everyone obviously, but what would it look like to be able to walk together in a way that is not schism? So stuff around, you know, conscience clauses, which, you know, no one is going to be forced to do these. You know, that was very clear speeches in synod as well. You know, that's just not happening. So I think for me, that's what I'm looking for now. I've been listening to those who see this as a really good slow, gentle step forward, but I want to know what it's going to look like to keep us walking together, but is not schism.
Thank you. I don't know if Will Moore might come in here. Will's an ordinand at Westcott House. I mean, one of the things that hasn't come forward in much detail is this sort of pastoral guidance, which a lot of ordinands may be waiting for, telling them about, you know, we know that the document Issues in Human Sexuality is sort of no longer, as it were. But you know, what the guidance might be for the sort of lifestyle of people coming forward for ordination, and how it might feel for some of your colleagues, Will, who are looking to be ordained and don't really know what's expected or required of them.
Yeah, that's what I've been thinking throughout this whole discussion. I think that's a huge issue. Yesterday was Groundhog Day, and for LGBT plus people, it was reopening wounds. It was a replay of February, and it was reopening wounds. And I'm sure that is happening for people across the church. But sitting in a room yesterday of ordinands, many queer ordinands, hearing the kind of language that's used against them, hearing sighs and moans and groans of hurt and disgust and sadness, is terrifying for some people here and people training for ordination. And I know there are people on both wings of the church that their ordination depends on what happens next. There are people here who want to get married to their partners. They don't want to be in a church that will not fully accept their love for their partner. And I know that is happening on the conservative wing as well, that there are ordinands that don't want to get ordained if these prayers of blessings come through either. So it is this point of uncertainty. And I think the sooner we get on with getting rid of issues and at least giving some sort of pastoral guidance, the better, because it really does impact the ministry of the church, the future ministry.
Thank you. Susie Leaf, I just want to come to you because we haven't yet talked about what the impact of this is on the wider Anglican communion. We've had statements from the Global South Fellowship of Anglican Primates who are saying that they're saddened by the resolution, that this creates some serious consequences for other provinces. You're used to work for Global Anglican Futures. You're still very closely associated with them. I mean, what are you hearing from other parts of the communion in the last 24 hours?
Well, I think we shouldn't be surprised by the difficulties that the Church of England is having about this situation. It's been something that has torn the fabric of the Anglican communion for the last 15, 20 years. It is I think that what Dean Mandy was saying is true, underlying the question of whether same-sex blessings should take place is a whole range of other issues, and that has divided the communion. I'm not hearing an enormous amount from either the overlapping groups of GAFCON and the Global South Fellowship. I think they've said what they believe, and I think they're getting on with mission now. I think that is very much the view that the churches have taken. Is it's that if the Church of England wants to make this decision, we are very saddened by that. As someone once put it, it feels like the Mother Church has lost its mind. That is the way in which they describe it. But if that is the case, well then that is very sad. But that doesn't stop them continuing the work that they are doing to be as what they would consider to be a faithful Anglican church around the communion. And I think when we talk about schism, schism was used in the debates yesterday as a phrase, and I think it's not a helpful phrase to use, but I think we always have to ask the question, where is this division coming from? And I think if you have a situation where you have two people who have promised something to one another, and one then says, actually, I'm changing the promises that I've made, and I want to change the promises that I've made. It is a very harsh thing to say to the person who says, well, I just want to stick with the promises we made to start with, that they are the one who is dividing the space. So I think we should be really careful in the way that we talk to one another. I think it's great to see this real desire to find a way forward for the Church of England. But if we're finding it difficult, I don't think we should be surprised, because it is something that has caused division throughout the world.
Thank you. So I'll go to Bishop Jill briefly, and then if Andrew, you want to come in, and then Helen King, I'd like to come back to you.
The word schism creates headlines, doesn't it? And that's whereas actually the bishop who was really influential in setting up the Anglican Communion, who's called Bishop Selwyn, Bishop of New Zealand, he was a massive church planter. And he said, just get on with mission. And as you plant in he had this beautiful quote, I ask you, how shall the truth of doctrine be maintained if we tolerate on the mission field every form of error and provide no safeguard for the purity of the faith? I answer that as running water purifies itself, so Christian work is seen to correct its own mistakes. In Blackburn Diocese, we've been demanding to do mutual flourishing, where we do disagree on something very important to our hearts and women's ordination. And my passion is to see mutual missioning and that outward-looking sense that I think is the hopeful way forward, which I think many contributors at Synod spoke so passionately about.
Thank you. Andrew, did you want to add something?
About the question of the pastoral guidance, because I think that is something that is the next thing that is going to have to be addressed. And the bishops have, not revealed what they're going to say, but it's obviously been trailed through leaks, and some people have seen drafts and reports of different votes. And I think the sooner that we can have transparency about what's happening there, transparency about the legal advice. My sense would be that the sort of argument that's now being put forward, which isn't about civil marriage and holy matrimony, but about this pastoral provision, time of uncertainty, it makes it more difficult to move to opening up the ordained ministry to those in same-sex marriages. But we'll have to see what's going on there. And as soon as that does happen, then the questions of conscience kick in very definitely at an episcopal level. They might to do with the liturgies. They certainly do when it comes to helping people in discerning their callings, putting them forward for ordination, laying hands on them in ordination, giving them licenses. And that again shows that we can't just narrow this down to, so-and-so in their parish doesn't have to do it. Because all of these things are connected, we will then face those questions, and as we move up, we are at a very low level of change on liturgy, and we need to recognize that. But as soon as we move on to questions around the guidance, that becomes much more significant, and that again makes the question about how we live well together even more pressing. And we don't just want more Groundhog Days on each of these different issues as we go through over the next 6 months. 12 months.
I just want to put to you something that Charlie Bell's written in the box. What's happening from GAFCON and others is planting churches into a different jurisdiction. That's schism and a challenge to our ecclesiology. Do you agree with that assessment?
Again, I'm not keen on the language of schism. I think that's not helpful. We are, as the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church, we are and have been for a long time a broken church. We are all of us in different ways in fellowship with people who are not in the same ecclesial structures as us in terms of having the same bishops or superintendents or whatever. We are seeing that fracture now within global Anglicanism. Well, it's been happening now for 20 years since Jean Robinson. It is now beginning to happen more and more in England. And in order that it doesn't become a total tear of schism and it doesn't become totally antagonistic, we need to do the sort of thing that was hinted at in Paul Butler's amendment, about recognising and making space for the differences. The sort of thing was talked about in Vaughan Robertson, has been discussed in the St Hugh's. I don't think that is schism.
Thank you. It's all kicking off in the chat box now about what schism is and isn't. We have to finish. We're 4 minutes away from 1 o'clock, and we need to get our lunch. But I'll just come, Helen King. I just wonder whether you might just offer a few thoughts on where we might be in another year or so, because some people are looking very weary. Some people are probably ready to walk away on both sides of the debate, and yet others are amazingly positive about, we're going forward somehow together. Tell me where you are. Tell me where you think the church will be in a year or two.
Yeah, okay. So I'm tired but amazingly positive. I think that's where I am at the moment. I think it is all to do with what we think the church is and how we think the church moves. So I hear this, we've got to be very respectful to those who hold what is the traditional position of the church, but we have moved. I think the church is a moving organization. It's led by the Spirit. It feels new things happening. There are new winds. They sometimes come in from society. We have to decide whether they are of God or not. This is actually a progressive organization, I believe. And I think we've moved on slavery. So if you say, well, slavery used to be okay, so we've got to respect people who still believe in it. Actually, there comes a point where you do need to move on. And I'm hoping that we might actually get to discuss something other than this in the next few synods. It would be lovely. I anticipate a lot more of this in February, because by then we'll have more of the documents available to look at. But I still think that we are going to move, because the prayers are going to be commended, at least for the use in existing services, hopefully in December. So there will be movement. And I think movement is growth, and growth is of the Spirit.
Thank you. I mean, just the phrase came into my mind is 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone. And you sometimes wonder whether the timescale couldn't be just sort of speeded up a little bit so that we're not all discussing the same thing for the next 10 years. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. This will be going on our YouTube channel. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And onwards and upwards, as they say. Thank you. Bye-bye.